Picture this. You are walking through a dense, damp forest. The air is thick, smelling of wet pine needles and decaying leaves. It is 50,000 years before the present moment. You are tracking an animal, moving fast, your eyes locked on the disturbed earth ahead of you. And then, you step wrong. Your foot comes down hard on a jagged, splintered branch hidden under the mud. It slices deep into the sole of your foot, tearing through the skin, ripping into the muscle. You fall to the ground. The pain is immediate and blinding. You look down, and your foot is covered in blood and dark, bacteria-rich earth. Now, if this happens to you today, it is an inconvenience. A highly irritating one, sure, but just an inconvenience. You limp back to your car. You drive to an urgent care clinic. A nurse cleans the wound with sterile saline. A doctor gives you 4 precise stitches, hands you a prescription for a 7-day course of broad-spectrum antibiotics, and you go home to complain on the internet about your medical copay. Within a week, you are completely fine. But right now, in this forest, there is no urgent care. There are no pharmacies, no sterile gauze, no ambulances, and absolutely no antibiotics. There is just you, a bleeding gash in your flesh, and a wilderness that is actively trying to reclaim you. And here is the question nobody actually asks when they think about our prehistoric ancestors. What happens next? How did we survive a world that was constantly, violently trying to tear us apart, long before the very concept of a doctor even existed? Not as in, does the human immune system kick in? Obviously yes, white blood cells do their job. We are not just talking about passive biology here. We are talking about intention. Did ancient humans actually know how to treat themselves, or was it all just blind animal instinct, licking a wound like a dog and hoping for the best? What if we are wrong about how primitive they were? What if the earliest humans were practicing a form of medical science so raw, so brutal, and so brilliant that it makes our modern first aid kits look unimaginative? If they did not figure this out, if they just died from every cut and scrape, our species would have bottlenecked into extinction before we even figured out agriculture. Your entire existence, the fact that you are sitting here breathing right now, depends on the fact that some ancient human in a cave figured out how to stop gangrene with nothing but dirt and weeds. And this is the rabbit hole we are going down today. Buckle up, because the sheer ingenuity of early human medicine is about to genuinely melt your brain. Let us start at the very beginning. What is the first thing you do when you are in agony in the Paleolithic? Let's start with the most obvious thing. You are hurt and you need a pharmacy. But your pharmacy is the forest floor. You will probably say, come on, they just grabbed whatever leaves were nearby and rubbed them on the wound. Trial and error. Maybe it worked, maybe it did not. Okay, then explain this. Back in 2017, an international team of researchers, led by a scientist named Laura Weyrich, was studying the remains of Neanderthals found in El Cidrón cave in northern Spain. These remains are roughly 50,000 years old. Now, when archaeologists want to know what an ancient human ate, they look at their teeth. Specifically, they look at dental calculus, hardened plaque. Plaque is basically a microscopic time capsule. It traps fragments of DNA from everything you put in your mouth during your lifetime. The researchers analyzed the plaque of one specific male Neanderthal from this cave. Let us call him the patient. The patient was not having a good time. His jawbone showed severe degradation. He had a massive, agonizing dental abscess, an infection deep in the root of his tooth that would have been causing him constant, throbbing, blinding pain. He also had an intestinal parasite that causes severe diarrhea. So, this guy was in agony, both in his head and in his stomach. But when they looked at the DNA trapped in his dental plaque, they found something that made the scientific community freeze. They found genetic traces of the poplar tree. Poplar bark contains salicylic acid. That is the active, pain-killing ingredient in modern aspirin. But wait, it gets crazier. They also found traces of a specific microscopic fungus, a mold, penicillium. Yes, exactly that, the natural source of penicillin. This Neanderthal, 50,000 years ago, was chewing on the exact plant that acts as a painkiller and consuming the exact mold that acts as a broad-spectrum antibiotic. And you might say, well, maybe he was just hungry and eating bark and moldy leaves. The honest answer is, we cannot ask him. But here is the thing. The other Neanderthals in that exact same cave, the ones who were healthy, who did not have massive jaw infections, they had no traces of poplar bark or penicillium in their teeth. Only the sick guy was eating the medicine. Let that land for a second. We are taught in school that Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin in 1928. And yes, Fleming isolated it and figured out how to mass produce it to save millions of lives. But the knowledge that this specific fuzzy mold somehow magically stops pain and sickness, that knowledge is older than our own species. Neanderthals were self-medicating with antibiotics tens of thousands of years before the first microscope was ever built. Imagine the generational knowledge required to figure that out. The countless generations of careful observation. Watching which plants make a sick person sweat, which ones make them vomit, which ones make the swelling go down. They mapped the chemical properties of the wild world using nothing but their own bodies as the laboratory. So here is where it gets interesting. Eating bark for a toothache is one thing, but what happens when the physical trauma is severe? Let us go back to your foot in the forest. Let us say you survived the initial cut. The bleeding stopped, but a few days later the wound is hot to the touch. It is swelling. The edges of the flesh are turning a sickening shade of black. It is necrotic, dead tissue. If you leave dead tissue attached to your body, the infection spreads to your blood and you are dead within a week. You need a surgeon to cut away the rotting flesh and leave the healthy flesh intact. And your surgeon, it turns out, has 6 legs. Welcome to the ancient practice of maggot debridement therapy. I know, it sounds absolutely revolting. But stay with me, because this is a masterpiece of biological engineering. For centuries, indigenous peoples across the globe, from the Aboriginal tribes of Australia to the Maya in Central America, understood a very specific fact about certain types of flies. Specifically, blowflies. When blowflies lay eggs in a wound, the eggs hatch into maggots, and these maggots are the most precise microsurgeons on planet Earth. They only eat dead, rotting flesh. They completely ignore live, healthy tissue. But they don't just eat the rot. As they feed, they excrete a chemical cocktail, a mixture of enzymes and antimicrobial compounds that literally disinfects the wound, changes the acidity, and promotes the growth of new, healthy human tissue. During World War I, an American doctor named William Baer noticed that soldiers who had been left out on the muddy battlefield for days with horrific, untreated wounds often survived if their wounds were infested with maggots. The soldiers who were brought into the hospital immediately and treated with the medical standards of the time often died of infection. Baer brought maggot therapy into modern hospitals, but he was just rediscovering what ancient people already knew. Picture the psychological fortitude it takes to do this. You are sitting by a fire, your leg is rotting. You actively seek out a piece of rotting meat that has blowfly eggs on it, and you deliberately introduce those writhing larvae into your own open flesh. You wrap it in leaves, you feel them moving inside you, you let them feed on you for 3 days, and then you wash them out, and the wound is clean, pink, and ready to heal. We think of ancient humans as primitive, acting on brute force. But this is the opposite of brute force. This is a delicate, calculated partnership with the most repulsive parts of nature, born out of pure, desperate observation. But what if the wound is too deep? What if the maggots clean it, but the flesh is yawning wide open? You need to close it. You need sutures. But you do not have a sterile needle, and you do not have surgical thread. Let me throw you something even wilder. If you were injured in certain parts of Africa or South America in the ancient world, the healer would go into the jungle and find an army ant, a driver ant, or a leafcutter ant. These insects are massive, and they have mandibles like tiny, razor-sharp bolt cutters. When they bite, they lock on, and they do not let go. The healer brings this furious, struggling ant to your wound. They take their fingers and pinch the 2 edges of your open skin together, closing the gash. Then, they hold the ant right up to the seam. The ant, in a panic, bites down as hard as it can, piercing both sides of your skin and locking its jaws across the wound. And then, the healer just twists the ant's body, snapping it off at the neck. The body falls away. The head remains, jaws permanently locked in a death grip, pulling your skin together. A perfect, organic, biodegradable surgical staple. The healer does this again and again, all down the line of the cut. I am not making this up. People genuinely did this. The jaws of these ants are so strong and the grip so permanent that the wound stays securely closed for days while it heals. Eventually, the insect head just falls off as the skin repairs itself. Honestly, I get stuck on this fact every single time. Imagine the first human to figure this out. They watched an ant bite them, felt the intense pain, saw how hard it was to pull the thing off, and instead of just stomping on it, they thought, wait a minute, I can use this. It is a level of lateral thinking that completely dismantles the idea of the dumb, grunting caveman. Okay, that is settled. They could medicate, they could clean, they could stitch. But here is where the story takes a sharp, unbelievable turn. What happens when the injury is not a cut? What happens when a boulder crushes a leg and the bone is shattered beyond repair? The limb is dead. It is a dead weight, dragging the person down, slowly poisoning them. Amputation. Now, up until the 19th century, amputation in Europe was a butcher's game. You bit down on a piece of leather, someone tied a tourniquet, and a man with a dirty metal saw hacked through your bone as fast as humanly possible while you screamed. There was no anesthesia, no antibiotics, and the chance of dying from blood loss or post-operative infection was terrifyingly high. Even with metal tools and medical books, it was a slaughterhouse procedure. So, logically, an amputation in the Stone Age should be impossible. You cannot cut through a human femur or tibia with a piece of chipped rock without the patient bleeding to death from a severed artery, or dying of shock, or succumbing to massive infection. Or so we thought. In 2020, a team of archaeologists led by Dr. Tim Maloney was excavating a remote limestone cave called Liang Tabo in the jungles of Borneo, Indonesia. They were digging deep into the floor of the cave when they found a grave. Inside was the skeleton of a young adult who had lived and died 31,000 years ago. They started brushing the dirt away, examining the bones. Everything looked normal: the skull, the ribs, the arms. But when they got down to the left leg, something was wrong. The lower leg was missing. The tibia and the fibula, the bones of the lower leg, ended abruptly, just below the knee. At first, the scientists thought maybe an animal had bitten it off, or maybe the bone had just broken and degraded in the soil over 30 millennia. But then they looked at the bones under a microscope. The cut was perfectly clean. It was slanted, and most importantly, the bone had remodeled. It had healed. The ends of the cut bone were covered in a dense layer of new, healed bone tissue. This person did not lose their leg to a crocodile. They had their leg surgically amputated. And they did not die on the operating table. The bone remodeling showed that this person lived for another 6 to 9 years after the surgery. Read that again. Well, hear it again. 31,000 years ago. This discovery sent shockwaves through the scientific community, because it implies things that we simply did not believe early humans were capable of. Think about the sheer mechanics of what had to happen in that cave in Borneo. The healer had no metal saw. They had a sharpened piece of stone, a lithic blade. They had to cut through the skin. They had to cut through the muscle. They had to carefully locate the major blood vessels and tie them off or compress them. Because if you just hack through a leg, the patient bleeds out in under 3 minutes. They had to saw through the dense matrix of human bone using a rock. And they had to do all of this while the patient was fully awake, feeling every single agonizing second of it. But the surgery is only half the miracle. Think about the post-operative care. Borneo is a tropical rainforest. It is hot, wet, and absolutely teeming with aggressive bacteria. How did they keep the stump clean? Did they use specific mosses with antiseptic properties? Did they constantly wash it with boiled water or herbal infusions? The honest answer is, we do not know. Science can describe the healed bone, but it cannot crawl inside the experience itself and tell us exactly how they managed the infection. But we know they did. And beyond the medicine, think about the logistics of life. This person was a hunter-gatherer. Their entire society was built on moving, foraging, hunting. A person with one leg cannot hunt. They cannot run. In the brutal calculus of survival of the fittest, a one-legged person is a burden. But this tribe did not leave them behind. For 6 to 9 years, the community carried this person. They fed them. They protected them. They valued them enough to undergo the unimaginable stress of that surgery and the years of care that followed. And that is just bone. But what about the things that are smaller? The invisible threats. Let's shift gears for a second. Let's say your bones are intact, your skin is whole, but you made a terrible mistake at dinner. You are starving, and you dig up a wild tuber or find a handful of bright berries. You eat them. An hour later, your stomach is cramping so violently you cannot stand up. You are sweating. Your vision is blurring. You have ingested a lethal plant toxin. If you do not get it out of your system, your liver will fail and you will die in the dirt. What do? You eat dirt. Literally. You find a very specific type of earth and you eat it. This is a practice called geophagy, and it is one of the oldest medical treatments in human history. And we didn't invent it. We stole it from animals. If you go to the Amazon rainforest today, you can watch flocks of brilliantly colored macaws gather by the thousands on the steep clay banks of the river. These birds eat a diet that includes a lot of toxic seeds. If they just digested the seeds, they would die. But after they eat, they fly to the riverbank and aggressively eat the raw clay. The clay contains negatively charged particles. Inside the bird's stomach, these particles bind to the positively charged toxins from the seeds, neutralizing them. The clay acts like a biological sponge, locking up the poison so it safely passes through the digestive tract without entering the bloodstream. Early humans were the ultimate observers. They watched the animals. They saw monkeys and birds eating specific types of clay when they were sick. And so our ancestors started digging up kaolin clay and eating it when they had food poisoning or severe gastrointestinal distress. We know they did this because we find the chemical signatures of consumed clay in ancient coprolites, which is the polite archaeological term for fossilized human feces. And you might think, wow, eating dirt, how primitive. But go to your medicine cabinet right now. Look for the pink liquid you drink when your stomach hurts. The active ingredient in medications like kaopectate originally derived its name and its function from that exact same kaolin clay. We just put it in a plastic bottle, added some artificial cherry flavoring, and charged $8 for it. The mechanics of the medicine have not changed in 50,000 years. So, we have herbs for pain, maggots for rot, ants for sutures, flintstones for amputation, clay for poison. It paints a picture of ancient humanity that is deeply competent, deeply grounded in the physical reality of the world. They observed, they tested, they survived. But here is the part we do not like to talk about. And now I have to tell you the other side of this. Because the story of ancient medicine is not just a triumphant march of clever survival tricks. There is a dark, heavy shadow to all of this. And this is where it stops being a fascinating list of facts and becomes something deeply unsettling. Everything we have talked about so far is physical. A cut, a break, a poison. Things you can see, things you can touch, things that have a clear cause and effect. But the human body is vastly more complex than a machine made of meat and bone. What happens when the sickness is not physical? What happens when the illness is in the mind or in the nervous system? Imagine you are living 7,000 years ago. One day, your brother, who has always been perfectly healthy, suddenly collapses by the fire. His eyes roll back in his head, his body goes completely rigid, and then he begins to thrash violently against the dirt. Foam comes from his mouth. He is unresponsive. Today, we look at that and say, epilepsy. A neurological misfiring, an electrical storm in the brain. But to an ancient human, an electrical storm in the brain does not exist. They do not know what a neuron is. They look at their brother thrashing on the ground, seemingly controlled by an invisible force, and they reach the only logical conclusion available to them. He is possessed. A spirit, a demon, an invisible entity has entered his head. It is trapped inside his skull, and it is thrashing around trying to get out, torturing him in the process. Or perhaps he has a blinding, chronic migraine that lasts for weeks. A pain so deep and localized, they are convinced there is a physical pressure inside the bone. How do you cure a trapped spirit? How do you relieve a pressure you cannot see? You give it a door. Welcome to trepanation, the oldest surgical procedure in the history of our species, and easily the most horrifying. Trepanation is the act of drilling, cutting, or scraping a hole into the human skull to expose the dura mater, the protective membrane surrounding the brain. We have found trypan skulls on almost every continent on Earth, from ancient Peru to the steppes of Russia to burial sites in France. Let us look at one specific anchor point. In the late 1800s, an anthropologist named Paul Broca was presented with a skull found in a Neolithic burial site in France, dating back roughly 7,000 years. The skull belonged to a prehistoric human, and right on the top of the head was a massive, perfectly circular hole. At first, scientists in the 19th century refused to believe it was surgery. They assumed it was battle damage, or that the hole was cut after the person was already dead, maybe to make an amulet out of the bone. The sheer arrogance of the Victorian era could not accept that savages were performing neurosurgery. But Broca looked closer, and he saw the terrifying truth. The edges of the hole were smooth. They were rounded. Bone remodeling had occurred. The person had not only been alive when the hole was cut, they had survived it. I want you to drop all your modern comfort and sit with this for a moment. Place yourself inside that scene. You are the patient. You have been suffering from seizures. The shaman, the healer of the tribe, tells you that the only way to save your life, the only way to let the demon out, is to open your head. There is no anesthesia. There is no sterile operating theatre. You are taken to a clearing. Maybe they give you some fermented berries or some mildly narcotic herbs to dull the edge, but it will not be nearly enough. People hold your arms and legs down. The healer takes a scraper made of flint or obsidian, a sharp, jagged rock. They press it to your scalp. They slice the skin away, pulling it back to expose the white bone of your skull. And then they start to scrape. Not a drill. A drill would be too fast. They use the stone to scrape a groove into your skull, back and forth, over and over, grinding the bone down to dust, layer by agonizing layer. You feel the vibration echoing through your teeth. You hear the sickening, gritty sound of rock grinding against your own skeleton. This process takes hours. Hours of unimaginable, white-hot agony. You are fully conscious. You are bleeding heavily from the scalp. They keep scraping until they finally break through the inner table of the skull and a piece of bone pops free, exposing the pulsing, vulnerable surface of your brain. The hole is made. The demon is released. The wound is wrapped in leaves and you are left to recover. And the detail that absolutely freezes the blood is this: they survived. By modern archaeological estimates, looking at thousands of trypan skulls from around the ancient world, upwards of 70% of the patients survived the procedure. They didn't die of infection. They didn't die of brain swelling. They lived for years, walking around with a literal window in their heads, covered only by skin. Think about the desperation, the absolute terrifying vulnerability of being a human being in pain, surrounded by people who love you, who are willing to torture you to save you, based on a completely wrong understanding of the universe. Because let us be brutally honest here, trepanation did not cure epilepsy. It did not release a demon. All it did was inflict monumental trauma on an already suffering person. This is the heavy side of the coin. The same fierce intelligence that figured out how to use ants to sew a wound shut also convinced us that we needed to bore holes in our loved ones' heads to fight ghosts. When the physical world made sense, our ancestors were brilliant. When the physical world broke down into the invisible, their attempts to control it were a nightmare. The suffering endured in the name of ancient medicine is almost impossible to quantify. We suffered because we were smart enough to try to fix things, but not yet knowledgeable enough to know how everything worked. The fear of the unknown drove us to mutilate ourselves in the hope of salvation. And right about now, you are probably feeling a profound sense of relief that you were born in a century with MRI machines and general anesthesia. But let us pull back from the darkness for a second. Let us look at the entire picture we have just painted. From the Neanderthal chewing moldy bark, to the severed leg in Borneo, to the terrifying scraping of the trepanation stone. What is the actual through line here? What is the one thing that connects all these bizarre, brutal, brilliant moments across hundreds of thousands of years? It is not just a collection of weird ancient trivia, it is the story of human defiance. Look at the natural world. Look at a pack of wolves or a herd of gazelles. Nature operates on a cold, mechanical, mathematically cruel law. The weak die. A wounded animal is a dead animal. If a wolf shatters its leg, the pack might linger for a day, but eventually they move on. They have to. The injured animal is left to the predators or to starvation. There is no hospital in the wild. There is only the end. But humans? Somewhere along the evolutionary line, humans looked at that cold, mechanical law of natural selection and we said, no. We refused to accept it. There is a famous story among anthropologists, often attributed to Margaret Mead. A student asked her what she considered to be the first true sign of human civilization in a primitive culture. The student expected her to say a clay pot, or a grinding stone, or the invention of the wheel, or a weapon. Instead, she supposedly said that the first sign of civilization was a femur, a thigh bone, that had been broken and then healed. Because a healed femur in the animal kingdom is impossible. If you break your leg in the wild, you cannot run from danger, you cannot hunt for food, and you cannot get to the river to drink. You are meat for the first predator that finds you. A healed femur means that someone stayed. Someone stayed with the injured person. Someone bound the wound. Someone brought them water. Someone gathered food for them and stood watch in the dark with a spear to keep the lions away while the bone took months to knit itself back together. The true miracle of ancient medicine is not the penicillin, it is not the ants, it is not the clay. The miracle is the empathy. We are the species that refuse to let each other go. Even the horrors of trepanation. Yes, it was brutal. Yes, it was misguided and based on a false belief in demons. But look at the intention beneath the horror. They didn't cast the epileptic person out of the tribe. They didn't throw them to the wolves because they were broken. They spent hours risking the person's life, undertaking an exhausting, terrifying surgery, all because they desperately wanted to bring their brother, their sister, their child back to themselves. It was an act of extreme, desperate care. When we look at the history of ancient medicine, we are not just looking at the history of science. We are looking at the history of love weaponized against death. Every scraped bone, every mashed herb, every insect bite was a prehistoric human standing in the dark, screaming at the universe, "You cannot have this person. They are mine." And this feels both incredibly sad and overwhelmingly beautiful to me. We suffered so much in the dark, but we suffered together. We fought for each other, blindly, violently, with whatever we could pull from the dirt. Which brings us right back to where we started. It is modern day. You are in your bathroom. You are looking at that minor cut on your foot from stepping on a sharp branch in the yard, or maybe you just nicked your finger chopping onions for dinner. You turn on the faucet. Clean, treated water washes the wound. You dab it with a perfectly sterile alcohol wipe. You peel the paper off a tiny, mass-produced adhesive bandage and you press it onto your skin. It takes 10 seconds. You do not even think about it. It is entirely ordinary. But look at your hand right now. Seriously, look at the bandage. Look at it through everything we have just learned. It is the same human skin. It is the same blood. But now you know what stands behind that tiny piece of plastic and gauze. You are the beneficiary of tens of thousands of years of trial, error, agony, and fierce, stubborn survival. You are standing on a mountain of ancestors who chewed bitter bark, who sewed flesh with insect jaws, who endured the scraping of the stone, all so that the human lineage would not be extinguished. They fought the absolute brutality of nature with nothing but mud and empathy, just so you could stand here today in safety. We did not survive the ancient world because we were the strongest animals. We survived because we were the only creatures who decided that saving each other was worth the trouble. If you have got a scar somewhere on your body right now, run your finger over it today. And tell me in the comments, what is the silliest, most ridiculous modern injury you have ever gotten that would have absolutely taken you out 50,000 years ago? I read these and honestly, they always make me appreciate modern medicine a little more. And if you like looking at our weird, beautiful world this way, if you like finding the abyss hiding behind the ordinary, hit subscribe and join us. Let's keep exploring together.